The world had been reduced to the jarring shudder of wagon wheels and the biting whip of the wind for 3 weeks. For Eleanor Vance. The journey had stripped away everything but the bone-deep ache of exhaustion and the thin, fraying thread of a promise made in a letter. The paper, now soft and worn as old linen, was tucked inside her bodice. The words from a man named Harold Vickers, a half-remembered prayer. He had written of a new life under a wide Montana sky, of a claim rich with possibility, and of a home waiting for a woman to make it whole. He had not written of the mud, the cold that seeped through her wool coat and settled in her marrow, or the profound, crushing loneliness of the landscape. Grady's Hill was not a town so much as a wound carved into the side of a mountain. A single, muddy street, rutted and frozen, was flanked by a collection of raw timber buildings that seemed to lean against one another for support against the relentless wind. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, a grim gray against a sky the color of slate. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, wood smoke, and something metallic and raw, the very smell of the earth being torn open for its treasures. As the mule cart creaked to a halt before the largest of the buildings, a 2-story structure with the words, "The Gilded Cage Saloon Provisions," painted in faded yellow letters, Eleanor felt a fresh wave of uncertainty wash over her. This was it, the end of the line, the beginning of a life she could not yet imagine. She paid the driver, her fingers stiff and clumsy with cold as she counted out the coins. He grunted, not meeting her eyes, and began to unload her single trunk, dropping it into the half-frozen slush with a thud. He was already turning the mule around before she could form the words to ask him where she might find Mr. Vickers. He was just another in a long line of men who had looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal since she had left St. Louis. A woman alone was a question, and out here, most men did not care for the answer. Gathering the damp skirts of her traveling dress, Eleanor stepped into the saloon. The sudden warmth was a shock, thick with the smells of stale whiskey, sweat, unwashed bodies, and frying meat. A hush fell over the room. A dozen faces, bearded and hard-edged, turned to stare. Their eyes raked over her, noting the fine weave of her coat, the small, feathered hat pinned to her tightly coiled hair, and the distinct, unwelcome air of the East that clung to her like a foreign perfume. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the man behind the long, scarred bar. He was wiping a glass with a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a large man, with a great black beard and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, even a woman like her walking into a place like this. "I am looking for Mr. Harold Vickers," she said, her voice sounding small and thin in the sudden silence. "He was expecting me." The bartender stopped wiping the glass. He set it down with a soft click. "Vickers, you say?" "Yes, he has a claim nearby. He sent for me." She forced herself to stand taller, to not let the weight of their stares bow her shoulders. "I am Eleanor Vance, his fiancée." A low chuckle rippled through the room. The bartender's expression did not change, but a shadow of something, pity, perhaps, passed through his eyes. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the bar. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I am sorry to be the one to tell you this. Harold Vickers is dead." The words did not seem to register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning, lost in the hum of the room. Dead. The word was a stone, dropping into the still well of her hopes. "Dead?" she repeated, the word a dry whisper. "How?" "Got himself into a dispute over his claim markers. Man by the name of Jebediah Stone said Harold moved his posts. They had words. Then they had guns." The bartender shrugged, a gesture that encompassed the finality and the commonness of it all. "Harold was slower. Stone's in the sheriff's custody down in Bozeman. But that don't help Harold none. He was buried 2 days ago." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "The claim's all tangled up now. Contested." The room began to spin. The faces of the men blurred into a single, leering mask. The promise in the letter, the entire purpose of her brutal journey, had dissolved into a puff of gun smoke 3 days before she had even arrived. She was not a bride. She was not even a widow. She was nothing. A piece of mail delivered to a dead man. She must have swayed, for the bartender's voice cut through the fog. "You all right there, ma'am?" She nodded, though the motion was jerky. "Disconnected. I need a room. A place to stay." The man shook his head slowly. "We got rooms, but they ain't for ladies. Not a lady like you." His gaze was not unkind, but it was firm. "The boarding house next door might have something. Ask for Martha." Eleanor turned, her legs feeling like wood, and walked back out into the cold. The whispers followed her, no longer held back by courtesy. Mail order bride for a dead man? The widow who never wed. What's she gonna do now? The cold felt different this time. It was no longer just the weather. It was the chill of every closed door, every judgmental eye. Martha, a thin, sour-faced woman with her hair pulled into a severe bun, took one look at Eleanor's unescorted state and the story in her eyes and declared she had no rooms available, despite the clear vacancy sign hanging in her window. The general store owner, a portly man with nervous, darting eyes, refused to extend her any credit for supplies, even when she offered her locket as collateral. She was a blight, a problem no one wanted to solve. An unmarried, unescorted woman from the East was a complication, and in Grady's Hill, complications, like land disputes, often ended badly. The rougher men in town were less subtle. They did not whisper. They spoke to her directly as she walked the muddy street, their words crude and suggestive. They saw her not as a woman in mourning for a life that would never be, but as an opportunity. She was alone, unprotected, and desperate. Her quiet demeanor, her refusal to meet their insolent gazes was taken not as modesty, but as weakness. Her Eastern clothes, which had once felt like a symbol of her refinement, now felt like a target on her back. Defeated, she found herself sitting on a wooden crate outside the general store, her trunk beside her like a coffin. The snow, which had been falling in lazy, gentle flakes, began to come down in earnest, thick and wet, clinging to her coat and hair. She had nowhere to go. The money she had would not last long, and no one would give her shelter. The vast, unforgiving wilderness she had traveled through was now staring back at her from the faces of the people in this town. She pulled her coat tighter, a useless gesture against a cold that was coming from within. She had run from a gilded cage in St. Louis, a life of quiet suffocation, only to find herself trapped in an open, frozen wasteland with no bars to even hold on to. He saw her from inside the store. Jack Coulter did not make a habit of noticing people. People were trouble. They had expectations, questions, and memories you did not want to share. He preferred the silent company of his horse and the steadfast solitude of his cabin, tucked high up in the pines where the wind spoke a language he understood. He had come to town for flour and coffee, a trip he made only when necessary, and had intended to be on his way before the storm truly set in. But he had seen her. He had been standing by the counter when she'd been turned away, had seen the flicker of panic in her wide, gray eyes before she had masked it with a fragile wall of composure. Now, watching her through the wavy glass of the storefront window, he saw that wall beginning to crumble. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, as the snow began to blanket her shoulders, a small, dark figure slowly being erased by the encroaching white. He saw the way the other men looked at her, their eyes hungry and speculative. He recognized the look. He had seen it on the faces of wolves circling a wounded deer. Something inside him, a rusty, little-used gear, ground into motion. It was not pity. He had no use for pity. It was a kind of weary recognition. He knew what it was to be alone and cornered, with a low curse muttered under his breath. He paid for his supplies, slung the sack over his shoulder, and pushed the door open. The cold hit him, but he barely noticed. He walked over to her, his boots making soft, crunching sounds in the fresh snow. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. Fear and exhaustion warred in her eyes. Jack had a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down his jawline, a pale, jagged line that pulled at his skin when he spoke and gave him a permanent, grim expression. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, distant and cold. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze taking in the refined misery of her posture, the unsuitable shoes peeking out from beneath her hem. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was a rasp, rough from disuse. "You'll freeze." She said nothing, just stared at him, her chin held high in a useless show of pride. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. The inclination to turn around, to get on his horse and ride away from this complication, was immense. But the image of her, frozen solid on this crate come morning, stuck in his mind. "The storm's moving in. It's going to be a bad one. There's no room for you in this town." "I am aware," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. He shifted the weight of the flour sack on his shoulder. He was a fool. He knew he was a fool for what he was about to say. "I have a cabin. Up in the mountains. There's space." He said the words as if they were being dragged from him. "Just for the storm. When it breaks, you are on your own." He fixed her with a hard stare. "Do not expect smiles." Eleanor looked at this man, at his scarred face and his cold, uninviting eyes. Everything about him screamed danger. He was a stranger, a recluse, offering her shelter in a place even more isolated than this hostile town. Every instinct she had, every lesson of propriety she had ever learned, told her to refuse. But then she looked down the muddy street, at the closed, unwelcoming doors, at the leering faces in the saloon window. She felt the wet chill of the snow seeping into her bones. The danger here was certain. The danger with him was, at least, a chance. Survival was a currency that trumped all others. She gave a single, hesitant nod. "Thank you." He did not acknowledge her gratitude. He simply grunted, then turned and hefted her trunk onto his other shoulder with an ease that spoke of immense strength. "My horse is at the livery. Keep up." He did not look back to see if she was following. He did not need to. He knew she would. It was her only option. The ride up the snowy pass was a silent, punishing ordeal. Jack's horse, a sturdy roan, picked its way sure-footedly up the steep, winding trail. But Eleanor struggled to follow on foot. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, a blinding curtain of white that muffled all sound save for the wind howling through the tall pines and the rhythmic crunch of their steps. The temperature dropped with every foot of elevation they gained. Jack had given her no quarter, setting a relentless pace that left her gasping, her lungs burning with the thin, icy air. He rode ahead, a stoic silhouette against the swirling snow, never once looking back. The tension between them was a palpable thing, a taut wire stretching through the cold air. He was a man sealed in a tomb of silence, and she was an unwelcome guest at its door. She focused on the back of his coat, on the steady rhythm of his horse's gait, using it as an anchor in the disorienting whiteness. To fall behind was to be lost, to be swallowed by the storm. She stumbled several times, her city shoes useless on the slick, uneven ground, but she always pushed herself back up, her hands raw and scraped, her determination a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had not come this far to die on the side of a mountain. It was nearly dark when they finally arrived. The cabin was small, built of thick, dark logs, with a low-pitched roof heavy with snow. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, hunkered down against the side of the mountain as if bracing itself for a long siege. A thin tendril of smoke was rising from its chimney, a sign that he had banked the fire before leaving. Jack dismounted and, without a word, pushed open the heavy door. He dropped her trunk and his supplies just inside, then moved to the large stone hearth, stoking the glowing embers back to life. Flames licked up, casting flickering shadows across the single room. It was as stark and unadorned as the man himself. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A single bed, covered with a thick buffalo hide, was tucked into one corner. Shelves holding a few tins, a handful of books, and some cast-iron cookware lined one wall. The space was clean, orderly, and profoundly empty of any softness or sentiment. It was the home of a man who needed nothing more than basic shelter from the elements. Eleanor stepped inside, closing the door against the raging storm. She stood awkwardly by the entrance, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, unsure of what to do next. Jack straightened up from the fire, his face illuminated by the growing light. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "That bed is yours," he said, gesturing to the one in the corner. "I will take my room." He nodded toward a closed door she had not noticed before. "You are not to enter it, ever." He walked over to the table and began to unpack his supplies. "Second rule," he continued, his back to her. "Do not ask me questions. I am not interested in your story, and I will not be sharing mine. We are strangers sharing a roof until the storm passes." "Nothing more?" Eleanor simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She understood. He was offering her shelter, not companionship. He was drawing a line in the dirt, and she was to stay on her side of it. He set a pot of coffee to warm by the fire and portioned out some jerky and hardtack onto 2 plates. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the mournful howl of the wind outside. The food was tasteless, but it was warm, and it filled the aching emptiness in her stomach. When they were finished, he took the plates, rinsed them in a bucket of water, and placed them back on the shelf. Then, without another word or even a glance in her direction, he took a blanket from a chest at the foot of her bed and disappeared into his room, shutting the door firmly behind him, left alone in the flickering firelight. Eleanor felt the full weight of her situation settle upon her. She was stranded in a stranger's cabin, miles from a town that despised her, with a future as blank and white as the blizzard raging outside. She sank onto the bed, the buffalo hide surprisingly soft beneath her, and pulled one of the rough wool blankets up to her chin. Sleep, she knew, would be a long time coming, but exhaustion was a powerful sedative. Eventually, her eyes drifted shut. She fell into a fitful, dream-plagued sleep, only to be jolted awake hours later by a sound that cut through the noise of the storm. It was a cry, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony, ripped from a man's throat. It came from behind the closed door. Eleanor sat bolt upright, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, her breath held tight. "No, leave him!" Jack's voice, thick with sleep and terror. "Sand Creek! God, the fire!" There was a thud, as if he had thrown himself against a wall. Then came the names, choked out between ragged gasps for air. "Miller! Elias, hold the line! For God's sake, hold the—" His voice broke on a sob, a desperate, wrenching sound that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the silent cabin. She heard the sounds of a man drowning, not in water, but in a sea of blood-soaked memories. She heard battlefield commands, the screams of dying men, and the terrible, hollow echo of a past that was anything but dead. He was not just a quiet, scarred cowboy. He was a man haunted by ghosts. And tonight, in the depths of his sleep, she had heard them screaming his name. She lay back down, pulling the blanket over her head, but she could not block out the sounds of his private war. The silence that had filled the cabin earlier had been a lie. This place was not empty at all. It was filled with the clamor of unspeakable things. And for the first time since meeting him, Eleanor felt not just fear, but a flicker of something else, a terrifying, unwelcome stirring of compassion. The storm did not pass. It settled over the mountain like a shroud, a vast and living thing of wind and endless snow. For 3 days, the world beyond the cabin walls ceased to exist, erased by a swirling vortex of white. The wind was a constant, mournful cry, sometimes rising to a vengeful shriek, other times sinking to a low, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. The cabin, which had at first felt like a prison, slowly transformed into a tiny, self-contained universe, an arc of warmth and flickering light against a deluge of white. Jack moved through this universe with a quiet, practiced economy. He said almost nothing. The silence he had demanded on the first night became the bedrock of their existence, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered all but the most necessary of words. Yet, his actions spoke a language of their own, a gruff and reluctant dialect of care. Each morning, before she was fully awake, she would hear the scrape of his boots and the soft click of the door as he went out into the blizzard. He would return sometime later, his shoulders and hat caked with snow, his face raw from the wind, and drop a fresh load of perfectly split firewood by the hearth. He never announced it, never looked for thanks. The wood simply appeared, a silent testament to his foresight and strength. One afternoon, when the cold seemed to have seeped through the very logs of the cabin, she woke from a shallow nap to find 2 extra wool blankets folded neatly at the foot of her bed. They had not been there before. She knew he must have taken them from his own room, a violation of the space he had so fiercely guarded. But he said nothing, and she knew to ask would be to break the second of his 2 sacred rules. She simply pulled the rough, clean-smelling blankets over her and felt a warmth that had little to do with the wool. He was a hunter. He would disappear into the white maelstrom for hours, his rifle in hand, and return with a pair of rabbits or a snowshoe hare. He would skin and dress the animals with a swift, brutal efficiency that turned her stomach. Yet his hands, scarred and calloused as they were, moved with a surgeon's precision. He would then stew the meat with wild onions and dried herbs he kept in small leather pouches. When it was ready, he would ladle a generous portion into a bowl and set it on the table before her without a word, his face a mask of indifference. The stew was rich and savory, a lifeline against the gnawing cold and the monotony of hardtack. He was feeding her, keeping her warm, keeping her alive, all while maintaining a distance as vast and cold as the storm itself. Eleanor, accustomed to a life where usefulness was measured in social graces and delicate embroidery, felt a growing sense of worthlessness. She was a burden, another mouth to feed, another body taking up space by the fire. She resolved to try and help, to earn her keep in this stark, silent world. Her attempts were a litany of small disasters. The first time she tried to light the fire, she fumbled with the flint and steel, her soft hands unused to the task, and managed only to send a few pathetic sparks into the cold tinder. Jack, watching from the corner of his eye, finally let out an exasperated grunt. "You are going to waste the flint," he growled. He came over, knelt by the hearth, and took the tools from her. "Watch." His large hands moved with a familiar, patient grace, striking the steel at just the right angle, coaxing the spark into a tiny, fragile flame, and nurturing it with dry moss until it caught the kindling. He did not snap at her again, but the lesson was clear. This was his domain. Her next attempt was with the cooking. While he was out, she found some carrots and potatoes in a small root cellar beneath the floorboards. She would make a vegetable soup, but the knife felt heavy and awkward in her hand, and the vegetables resisted her clumsy efforts. The pieces she managed to cut were uneven, some too thick, others paper-thin. When Jack returned, he found her staring at the mangled pile with tears of frustration welling in her eyes. He stopped in the doorway, took in the scene, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, world-weary exhaustion. "Give me the knife," he said, his voice flat. He took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. "You hold it like this, firm. Let the blade do the work." He stood behind her, his presence a wall of solid warmth at her back, and guided her hand. His touch was impersonal, instructive, yet she was acutely aware of the strength in his grip, the rough texture of his skin against hers. Under his guidance, the blade moved smoothly, and the vegetables fell into neat, uniform pieces. He let go as soon as she had the rhythm of it, retreating back to his side of the room, but the faint impression of his hand lingered on hers. The days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the single, snow-caked window. The enforced proximity bred a strange, suffocating intimacy. They were 2 strangers sharing the same small pocket of air. Every breath, every movement, every sigh noted and catalogued in the crushing silence. The tension in the cabin grew thick enough to choke on. It was in the way he would abruptly stand and go outside when she came too near the fire, the way she would fall silent and still when he began cleaning his rifle. The meticulous, deadly movements of his hands, a conversation in themselves. One night, the storm reached a fever pitch. The wind howled like a legion of damned souls, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel even more confined. They sat at the table, the remains of their meager supper between them. The silence was heavier than ever. Eleanor could not bear it another moment. The words rose in her throat, a desperate tide of confession she could no longer hold back. "I did not love him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jack did not look up from the piece of leather he was mending. He gave no sign he had heard her. "Harold Vickers," she clarified, forcing the words out. "I never met him. I only had his letters. I did not love him. I was not grieving for a lost love when I arrived in Grady's Hill. I was grieving for a lost hope." He continued his work, his needle pushing through the thick leather with steady, rhythmic movements. But she saw the muscles in his jaw clench, a single, tight ripple beneath the scarred skin. Encouraged by that small reaction, she pressed on, the story tumbling out of her in a hushed, broken torrent. "I answered his advertisement because I had to get away. There was a man, back in St. Louis, my father's business partner. He was charming, wealthy. Everyone thought he was a gentleman. He asked for my hand, and my father agreed, but he was not a gentleman." The memory was a cold, slick thing in her mind. He hurt me. When I refused to be what he wanted, he grew angry. He had a cruel streak that no one else saw." She took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. "I had to escape." Marrying a stranger in Montana seemed safer than staying with a monster in Missouri. Harold's letter was a lifeline. Now that lifeline is gone. She fell silent, her confession hanging in the air between them. She had exposed the raw, ugly truth of her past, laid it bare in this stranger's cabin. She waited for a reaction, pity, disgust, dismissal. Jack said nothing. He finished his stitching, tied off the thread with a sharp tug, and put the leather and tools away. He rose from the table, walked to the hearth, and added another log to the fire, his movements as deliberate and unreadable as ever. He did not look at her. He did not offer a single word of comfort or judgment. But as he stood staring into the flames, his back to her, she saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides, the only outward sign of the storm her words had unleashed within him. The next morning, the storm had lessened slightly, and a pale, watery light filtered through the window. Eleanor woke early and saw him standing by the wash basin, stripped to the waist. The firelight played over the hard planes of his back and shoulders, a landscape of muscle and old, faded scars. She made to look away, a blush creeping up her neck, but her eyes snagged on a newer wound near his ribs. On his left side was a puckered, angry-looking scar, clearly from a bullet. He was tending to it, dabbing it gently with a damp cloth. He must have sensed her gaze, for he suddenly went still, then slowly turned. Their eyes met across the quiet room. It was a moment of profound, startling intimacy. She saw in his eyes a flash of vulnerability, of being seen in a way he had not intended. His usual guard was down, his face stripped of its grim mask, leaving only the weary, haunted man whose cries she heard in the night. She saw the pain etched around his eyes, the deep loneliness he wrapped around himself like a shield. Something inside her, a long dormant and tender thing, stirred to life, overwhelmed. She quickly looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The image of him, however, was burned into her mind. The scars, the strength, and the deep, hidden well of pain in his eyes. Later that day, the wind died down enough for them to step outside. The world was a masterpiece of white. The snow drifted into massive, sculptural forms. The pines heavy and bowed under its weight. The air was clean and sharp. "You need to learn to shoot," Jack said abruptly. The statement caught her completely off guard. I do not know how." "That is why you need to learn," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A woman alone out here is a target. You need to be able to defend yourself." He retrieved his rifle and a smaller, lighter one she had not seen before. He led her to a clearing behind the cabin. "This one's a Winchester, lighter kick." He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His instructions were clear and concise, and, to her surprise, he was incredibly patient. He corrected her stance, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder to adjust her position. He showed her how to load the cartridges, his large, scarred fingers moving with practiced dexterity next to her own trembling ones. As she fumbled with a bullet, their fingers brushed. A jolt, like a spark from the flint, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He did not seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. She was a terrible shot at first, flinching at the loud report, the bullets going wide, but he did not scold her. He just quietly told her to breathe, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. Slowly, her aim improved. She managed to hit the tin can he had set on a stump, the ping of the bullet striking metal a small, satisfying victory. She looked at him, a rare, genuine smile gracing her lips. He did not smile back, but the hard line of his mouth seemed to soften for just a moment, as twilight began to settle, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. A new sound broke the stillness, a low, hungry snarl. A wolf, gaunt and gray, had emerged from the tree line, its yellow eyes fixed on the small barn where Jack kept his horse. It was desperation that had driven it so close, the deep, unrelenting hunger of a hard winter. Before Eleanor could even process the threat, Jack had raised his rifle to his shoulder. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The crack of the shot was deafening in the silent air. The wolf yelped once, a short, sharp sound, and collapsed in a heap on the snow, a dark stain spreading around it. The suddenness of it, the casual, brutal finality of the act, sent a tremor through her. One moment it was a living, breathing creature. The next it was just a pile of fur on the snow. Life here was a fragile, fleeting thing. She must have made a small sound, for Jack turned to her. He saw her pale face, her wide, shocked eyes. He took a step closer, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He reached out, not with his hand, but with the back of his fingers, and brushed a snowflake from her cheek. Then he placed his hand on her back, a solid, grounding pressure between her shoulder blades. It was meant to be a gesture of comfort, of reassurance, but he did not pull away. His hand lingered, his thumb stroking a slow, gentle circle on the rough wool of her coat. It was the most deliberate touch he had yet given her, a silent acknowledgement of her fear, and it sent a wave of heat through her entire body. That night, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer empty, but charged, filled with the unspoken things that had passed between them that day. The shared glance over a scar, the brush of fingers over a rifle, the lingering touch in the snow. They sat by the fire, the wolf's pelt now stretched and curing on the far wall, a grim reminder of the wilderness that was always waiting just outside the door. Eleanor looked at Jack's profile, silhouetted against the flames. She saw the tension in his jaw, the rigid set of his shoulders. He was pretending again, retreating behind his wall of silence, acting as if the day had meant nothing. But she had seen behind the wall. She had felt the man beneath the armor. "You do not have to pretend," she said, her voice so soft it was almost part of the fire's crackle. He did not turn, he did not move. For a long moment, she thought he would ignore her, that he would retreat so far she would never find him again. The silence stretched, taut and thin. Then, slowly, without a word, he reached across the small space between them. He did not grab her hand, or even take it. He simply let his hand, calloused and warm, come to rest gently atop hers where it lay on her lap. It was not a gesture of passion or of demand. It was a statement, an answer, a confession that his own hands were speaking in a language his voice could not. in the quiet of the cabin, with the storm finally beginning to break outside, it was enough. The thaw was a lie. The brief respite from the storm gave way to a deeper, more entrenched cold that seemed determined to hold the mountains in its grip until the end of time. Winter settled in, not as a temporary siege, but as a permanent state of being. And within the small, snowbound world of the cabin, a new kind of quiet settled with it. It was no longer the sharp-edged silence of strangers, but a softer, more worn quiet, shaped by shared routine and the slow, unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence. Eleanor found a strange solace in work. She rose before the sun, her breath pluming in the cold air, and made her way to the small lean-to that served as a barn. There was a goat, a wiry, ill-tempered creature named Brimstone, who provided them with a thin but steady supply of milk. At first, her city-soft hands had ached with the unfamiliar task, the goat's teats feeling rough and alien in her grasp. But slowly, she learned the rhythm of it, the firm, steady pull, the warm stream of milk hissing into the bucket. It was a real, tangible thing. This milk, it was a contribution. It was a purpose. She took to mending Jack's shirts. They were made of thick, durable canvas and wool, but were frayed at the cuffs and torn in places from his work. She would sit by the fire in the long afternoons, her needle moving with a slow, careful precision she had once reserved for fine embroidery. Mending a tear in a working man's shirt felt more meaningful than any decorative stitch she had ever made. She would feel the thick, rough fabric under her fingers and think of the man who wore it, of the strength in his shoulders, of the scars that mapped his skin. She was, in a small way, mending him, stitching together the frayed edges of his solitary life. She learned to bake a dense, serviceable bread from his sack of flour and to make a passable soup from almost nothing. She kept the fire fed and the cabin swept, warming herself with the simple heat of labor. She did not do it for his approval, for he offered none. He would eat the bread and the soup, wear the mended shirts, and drink the goat's milk without comment, his face a stony mask. But she was no longer warming herself for him. She was doing it for herself, finding a new kind of strength in this harsh, demanding life, a strength she had never known she possessed. Jack's own language of silent actions evolved. His touch, once accidental and brief, became more present, more deliberate. When they went out to the woodpile, he would place a hand on the small of her back to guide her over a treacherous patch of ice, the pressure of his palm a steady, solid warmth that seeped through her coat. When she came in from the barn, her hair dusted with snow, he would reach out and brush the flakes away, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. He still said nothing. He never met her eyes for more than a fleeting second, but his hands were beginning to form sentences. To ask questions and offer answers his voice refused to shape. The tension between them changed. It was no longer a taut wire of suspicion, but the low, resonant hum of a plucked string, vibrating with an energy that was both unnerving and compelling. It filled the spaces between the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. It was there in the long, shared glances when they thought the other was not looking, and in the careful, deliberate way they moved around each other in the small, confined space. A slow and cautious dance of two wounded animals learning to share a den. One night, the wind returned with a vengeance, rattling the shutters and sending gusts of smoke billowing from the hearth. The storm outside was a mirror of the one that had been building inside the cabin for weeks. They sat in their usual places, the air thick with things unsaid. Eleanor could feel the questions bubbling up inside her, a need to understand the man who had saved her, the man whose nightmares she listened to every night. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet but clear over the din of the storm. "Did you ever love someone?" The question dropped into the silence like a stone. He went utterly still, his hands frozen on the knife he was sharpening. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone ceased. He stared into the fire, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching into hard knots. For a long time, she thought he would not answer, that she had finally crossed the line he had so clearly drawn. When he finally spoke, His voice was a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure, ragged pain. "She died screaming my name." The words were brutal, stripped of any sentiment, and they struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She had expected a gruff dismissal, or perhaps a simple yes or no. She had not expected this raw, bleeding wound of a confession. She said nothing, letting the terrible weight of his words settle in the space between them. He took a ragged breath, and it was as if that single crack in his armor had broken the dam. The words began to come, not in a flood, but in jagged fragments, sharp-edged pieces of a shattered past. "The war," he breathed, his gaze still fixed on the flames as if he were seeing something else entirely. "You see things a man is not meant to see. The smell of it, of men burning, the sounds they make." He shook his head, a short, violent motion. "We were told it was for a righteous cause, but I saw no righteousness, only butchery." He fell silent for a moment, and Eleanor held her breath, knowing that to speak would be to shatter the fragile trust he was offering. "I had a place after," he continued, his voice softer now, hollowed out. "A homestead, down on the Platte River. Good soil. Built the cabin myself. Had a wife, Sarah." He said the name as if it were a fragile, precious thing he had not held in his mouth for a very long time. She was like the spring, made things grow. We were going to have a child." He paused, and his hand drifted unconsciously to his chest, to the bullet scar she had seen. "Then the raiders came. They said the land was theirs. They said we did not belong. They burned it all, the cabin, the barn, everything." His voice broke, and he finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were not the cold, distant eyes she was used to. They were swimming in a sea of unspeakable grief. "I was away, trading for supplies. When I got back, there was only smoke. I found her in the wreckage. She screamed my name before she died." The story was laid bare between them, a testament to a life that had been utterly and completely razed. He had lost everything: his home, his wife, his child, his faith in the world, and in his mind. He had failed to protect them. That was the ghost that haunted him, the voice that screamed his name in the dark. Eleanor felt a wave of compassion so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. But she knew that pity was the last thing he wanted. Pity was an insult to the magnitude of his loss. He did not need her tears. He needed her to see his scars and not look away. Slowly, she rose from her chair and crossed the small space between them. She knelt on the hearthstone before him, the heat of the fire warming her back. He watched her, his eyes wary, his body tense, as if expecting a blow. She did not speak. Instead, she lifted a hand and gently, reverently, placed it flat against his chest, directly over the puckered scar near his heart. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart beneath her palm, a wild, trapped bird beating its wings against its cage. "We all carry something," she whispered. The touch was a spark in a tinderbox. The air between them crackled, turned electric. A shudder ran through his entire body. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then up at her face, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, raw intensity. He had shared the ugliest part of himself, and she had not flinched. She had met his pain with a quiet, steady strength. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, slowly uncurled. He lifted one, his movements hesitant, almost disbelieving, and cupped her face. His thumb stroked her jawline, his touch impossibly gentle for a man whose hands were so scarred and calloused. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The smell of pine and leather and wood smoke filled her senses. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between a desperate, soul-deep need and a lifetime of self-imposed exile. He was so close she could feel his breath on her skin. And then, with a choked sound that was almost a sob, he stopped. He pulled back, his hand dropping from her face as if her skin had burned him. He turned away, presenting her with his rigid, unyielding back. And the moment was broken, the electricity fizzling out into the cold, empty air. The next day was a torment of unspoken things. They moved around the cabin with a heightened, painful awareness of each other. The near kiss, the aborted moment of connection, hung between them, a ghost more present than any of the ones that haunted Jack's sleep. To break the suffocating tension, Jack declared they needed to chop more wood. They worked together in the clearing, the rhythmic thud of his axe a counterpoint to the sharp crack of the smaller hatchet she used to split kindling. The physical labor was a relief, a way to channel the roiling energy between them into something productive. But the awareness was still there, in the way his eyes would follow her as she bent to pick up a piece of wood, in the way her breath would catch when he swung the axe, the muscles in his back and arms cording with the effort. As she was carrying a load of kindling back toward the cabin, her foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice. She cried out, her arms pinwheeling as she lost her balance, the wood scattering around her. Before she could hit the ground, he was there. He moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. His arms wrapped around her, catching her and pulling her hard against his chest. The impact knocked the wind from her. She was pressed against him, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat, just over his collarbone. She could feel the solid, unyielding wall of his body, the frantic beating of her own heart, and the slow, heavy thud of his. She took a breath, and it clouded in the frigid air. A white plume against the dark fabric of his coat. He held her there, his grip tight, his arms a cage of muscle and warmth. It was longer than was necessary to simply stop a fall. It was an embrace, a desperate, possessive holding. She could have stayed there forever, safe and warm, her world reduced to the solid reality of him. But then she felt him tense, felt the battle begin anew within him, and he abruptly let her go, stepping back as if he had been burned. That night, the silence was unbearable. After their meal, Eleanor retreated to her bed, but she could not sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Jack's restlessness. She heard him pacing before the fire, the soft tread of his boots on the floorboards a map of his agitation. Finally! She heard him get up and go into his room, shutting the door behind him. But this time, the door did not click shut. It was left slightly ajar. An hour passed. The fire burned low, casting deep shadows in the corners of the room. A terrible, gnawing worry began to eat at her. The silence from his room was different. It felt heavy, desolate, hesitantly. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold on the floor. She crept to his door and pushed it open a little wider. The embers in the hearth cast just enough of a glow to illuminate the scene within. He was not in his bed. He was sitting on the edge of it, fully clothed, his head buried in his hands. His broad shoulders were slumped, his entire posture one of utter, soul-crushing defeat. He looked broken. "I ain't good," he said, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. He had not looked up. He had simply sensed her there. "Not for you. I am a ruin of a man. Everything I touch turns to ash." Eleanor's heart broke. She saw it all then. His silence, his distance, his retreat from her touch. It was not a rejection of her. It was a rejection of himself. He saw himself as a blight, a danger, a walking catastrophe, and he was trying to protect her from the wreckage of his own life. She walked into the room, the forbidden space, and knelt on the cold floor before him. She looked up at him, at the proud man brought low by his own ghosts. "You do not have to say anything," she said softly. She reached out and gently took one of his hands. Pulling it away from his face, she held it in both of hers, bringing his scarred knuckles to her lips and pressing a soft, reverent kiss to them. "You do not have to say a single word." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a storm of anguish and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He had no words. He had never had the words. But she had just given him permission to speak the only language he knew. Slowly, reverently. He reached out his other hand and laid it on her cheek. His hands, which had chopped wood and killed wolves and held guns, were now speaking of a tenderness so profound it made her ache. They spoke of loneliness and of fear, of a longing so deep it had nearly hollowed him out. They spoke of the woman who had made him feel something other than grief for the first time in an eternity. He drew her to him, and in the aching, hallowed silence of the room, with the firelight their only witness, he let his hands, and then his body, speak all the words he could not. The gray morning light that seeped through the window felt like an accusation. It illuminated a room that was suddenly and painfully silent, the air thick with the ghost of the night before. Eleanor lay still under the heavy blankets, her body humming with a strange, new ache that was part pleasure, part sorrow. She was acutely aware of Jack's presence, of his quiet movements as he rose from the bed. She kept her eyes closed, afraid of what she might see in his, afraid of the cold light of day. When she finally dared to look, he was already dressed, his back to her as he stood before the hearth, stoking the embers. The intimacy of the night had vanished, vaporized by the dawn. In its place was a rigid, unbreachable distance. He moved with a stiff, guarded economy, his shoulders set in a hard, unforgiving line. He did not look at her. He did not speak. It was as if the aching, silent language their bodies had spoken in the dark had been a foreign tongue he no longer remembered. A cold dread, sharper than the morning chill, crept into Eleanor's heart. He regretted it. The thought was a shard of ice. For him, it had been a moment of weakness, a lapse in his solitary vigil. And now the walls were back up, higher and thicker than ever before. She had offered him solace, and he had taken it. And now he was ashamed. The shame was a palpable thing in the room, a third presence that choked the air. He prepared coffee and hardtack, setting her portion on the table without a word. His movements clipped and impersonal. The silence was a torment, a stark contrast to the profound, non-verbal communication of the night. She wanted to scream, to demand he look at her, to ask him what had changed, but she said nothing, her own pride and a deep, gut-wrenching fear holding her tongue. They ate in the same crushing silence that had defined their first days together, a painful, bitter regression. As soon as he was finished, he pulled on his heavy coat, took his rifle from its pegs on the wall, and headed for the door. "I am going to town," he said, his hand on the latch, his gaze fixed somewhere over her head. He had not told her where he was going since the first day. The fact that he was telling her now felt less like a courtesy and more like a formal declaration of his separateness. "Will you be long?" she asked, her voice small. "As long as it takes," he said, and then he was gone, the door closing with a soft, final thud, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the deafening roar of her own anxious thoughts. The day stretched into an eternity. Eleanor tried to keep busy, to lose herself in the familiar routines of milking the goat and mending and cleaning, but every task was haunted by his absence. The cabin felt hollow, empty, the silence no longer companionable but desolate. Every creak of the logs, every sigh of the wind, made her jump, her head snapping toward the door, her heart leaping with a hope that was immediately dashed. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long, gloomy shadows across the snow, a new fear began to take root, a fear that quickly overshadowed her hurt feelings. Grady's Hill was a dangerous place. It was full of cruel men and cheap whiskey and simmering disputes that could erupt into gunfire over a misplaced word. What if something had happened to him? What if his trip had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a danger she could not imagine? The thought made her feel sick. She paced the small cabin, from the hearth to the window and back again, her hands twisting in the fabric of her skirt, a prisoner of her own powerlessness. Night fell, a thick, impenetrable darkness that swallowed the world. She lit the lamps, their small pools of golden light doing little to push back the encroaching gloom. She made a stew, more to have something to do with her hands than out of any real hunger, and set it by the fire to keep warm. She sat at the table, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats, her body a taut wire of anxiety. He was not coming back. He had taken the first opportunity to leave her, to abandon her just as everyone else had. The thought was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. It was late. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing coals. When she finally heard it, the soft crunch of a horse's hooves in the snow. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees felt weak. She rushed to the door, flinging it open to the frigid night air. He was there, a dark, hulking silhouette against the starlight, leading his horse toward the barn. He was safe. He did not come inside for a long time. She waited, the stew simmering on the hearth, her relief slowly curdling back into a nervous tension. When he finally entered, he brought a blast of cold air with him. He looked exhausted, his face grim and etched with lines of a deep, weary anger. He shut the door, threw the bolt, and stood there for a moment, just looking at her. "A man was in town," he said, his voice a low rasp. "At the saloon, asking questions." "What sort of questions?" Eleanor asked, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Asking if anyone had seen a woman from the east, young, with dark hair and gray eyes. Said her name was Eleanor Vance." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. The past she had run from, the monster she had tried to escape, had stretched its long arm all the way to this remote, frozen mountain. It had found her. "He said he was a friend of your father's," Jack continued, his eyes boring into hers, trying to read the truth in them. "Said he was sent to find you, to make sure you were safe. He described you perfectly." "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I said I had seen a woman matching that description pass through a week or so ago, headed west, toward the coast. I said she bought supplies and hired a guide to take her over the pass before the storm hit." He took a step closer, his face grim in the lamplight. "I lied for you, Eleanor." The weight of his words, the significance of his actions, settled on her. He had gone to town, a place he despised, and had put himself in the middle of her trouble. He had lied to a stranger to protect her. The distance he had so carefully cultivated all day had been a lie, a shield not against her, but for her. The truth, the whole, ugly, unvarnished truth, was the only thing she had left to offer him in return. The partial confession she had made before was a pale shadow of the real story. He deserved to know what kind of danger he had invited into his life. "His name is Martin Bellows," she said, her voice gaining a flat, deadened strength. "He was not a friend of my father's. He was my fiancé." She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the rest of the story poured out. A torrent of shame and pain that she had held inside for so long it had nearly poisoned her. "He was a predator disguised as a gentleman. My father saw only his wealth, his influence. He refused to see the cruelty in his eyes. The first time he struck me, it was not with an open hand. It was with his words, his coldness. The next time, it was with his fist." She looked down at her hands, seeing not the calluses from her work in the cabin, but the faint, faded bruises of another life. "I became pregnant," she whispered, the words a terrible secret she had never spoken aloud. I thought maybe a child would change him, soften him. It only made him worse. He grew angry, possessive. He said the child was another chain to bind me to him." Her voice broke. "There was a fight, an argument over something trivial. He pushed me. I fell. The fall. It took the baby." Jack made a low, guttural sound in the back of his throat, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. "I told my father," Eleanor continued, tears now streaming freely down her face. "I begged him to let me break the engagement, but the business arrangement between them was already signed. My father's fortune was tied to Martin, so he covered it up. He told people I had been ill. He made me go on as if nothing had happened, as if a part of my body and my soul had not been ripped away." She finally looked up, meeting Jack's furious, pain-filled gaze. "That is when I saw Harold Vickers's advertisement. I saw it not as a proposal of marriage, but as an escape route from hell. So I ran. I stole away in the night with what little money I had saved. I ran, and I did not look back." She stood before him, stripped bare, all her ugly secrets exposed to the lamplight. She had laid her shame at his feet, and she waited for him to turn away in disgust. He did not. He closed the remaining distance between them in a single stride. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her tear-streaked face. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw no anger, no distance, no ghosts in his eyes. She saw only a deep, profound, and sorrowful understanding. He lowered his head and pressed his lips to her forehead, a soft, lingering kiss that was a benediction, a promise of protection. "Ain't your shame to carry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "It is his, and your father's, not yours, never yours." But even as he offered her this profound comfort, she saw a new fear dawn in his eyes. The threat was no longer a vague ghost from her past. It was a real man, a violent man, who was actively searching for her. And now, Jack was afraid, not of the man, but for her. He was afraid that his cabin was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage, and that he, with his own history of violence and loss, would be the next danger to her life. The night he had spent in her bed had been a breach of his own defenses. Now, with the stakes so terribly high, he retreated. That night, he took a blanket and laid it on the floor before the hearth, as far from her bed as the room would allow. The gesture was a declaration, a reinstatement of the boundary, and it hurt Eleanor more than any angry words could have. He was trying to protect her, but it felt like a rejection all the same. He was retreating back into his silence, into his cold, solitary fortress, and locking the door behind him. The next few days were an agony of strained silence and unspoken tension. Eleanor tried to pull him back, to breach the wall he was so carefully rebuilding. She would try to start conversations, ask him about his horse, about the weather, about anything at all, only to be met with monosyllabic grunts. She would try to touch him, a fleeting brush of her hand against his arm, but he would flinch away as if her touch were a hot iron. The breaking point came one evening, after another day of suffocating silence. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements precise and methodical, the soft clicks of the metal a maddening rhythm in the quiet room. "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor finally burst out, her voice tight with frustration and unshed tears. "Why are you pushing me away?" He did not look up. "It is for the best." "The best for whom?" she demanded. "It certainly does not feel like it is for the best for me. It feels as if you are punishing me." He finally stopped his work and looked at her, his face a hard, unyielding mask. "I am not the man you think I am. You deserve someone better, someone whole. Not a broken thing that lives on a mountain because he cannot stand the sight of other people." "I do not want someone better," she cried, her voice rising. "I do not want a whole man. I want you, the man who gave me shelter when no one else would, the man who taught me to shoot, the man who held me in the night and made me feel safe for the first time in years." She took a step toward him, her hands clenched at her sides. "Stop pretending! Stop pretending you do not want me! Want you?" he exploded, surging to his feet, his face a maelstrom of anguish and fury. The rifle clattered to the floor. "Forgotten. Of course I want you. God help me. I have wanted you since I first saw you sitting in the snow, looking like a lost angel. But what I want does not matter. Do you not understand? Men like me, we break things. We destroy everything we touch." The words ripped out of him, torn from the deepest, most terrified part of his soul. The iron control he had maintained for so long finally shattered, and the raw, bleeding truth of his fear was laid bare. "I am terrified," he choked out, the words barely a whisper. "I am terrified of hurting you. I am terrified of him finding you, and me not being strong enough to stop him. I am terrified of what I would do to him if he laid a hand on you, and I am terrified of being broken again. I buried my wife and my child. I will not, bury you too." He stared at her for a heart-stopping moment, his chest heaving, his face a mask of utter despair. Then, with a strangled cry, he turned and fled, stumbling out of the cabin and into the cold, dark night. Eleanor stood frozen, the force of his confession echoing in the sudden silence. He was not pushing her away out of regret or indifference. He was pushing her away out of love, a fierce, desperate, terrified love that saw itself as a curse rather than a gift. She waited a few minutes, giving him time, then pulled on her coat and followed him out. The moon was high, casting a pale, ethereal glow on the snow-covered landscape. She found him by the barn, his back against the rough-hewn logs, his face buried in his hands. His broad shoulders were shaking with great, silent, racking sobs. The sound of his grief was the most devastating thing she had ever heard. The man who had faced down storms and wolves and the ghosts of war was weeping like a lost child. She went to him, but she did not speak. There were no words that could touch a pain so deep. Instead, she knelt in the snow beside him and simply wrapped her arms around him. She held him, her cheek pressed against his shaking back, offering him the silent, steadfast comfort he had once offered her. He sagged against her, his sobs quieting into long, shuddering breaths. She held him until the shaking stopped, until he was just a heavy, exhausted weight in her arms. She held him until he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, his head resting on her shoulder, a broken soldier who had finally surrendered on the battlefield of his own heart. A warm wind, a chinook, had begun to blow down from the mountains, and as she held him, she felt a drop of water on her cheek. It was not a tear. It was a drop of melting snow from the eaves of the barn. The great thaw was beginning. Spring was coming, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that danger was coming with it. The thaw brought with it a sense of precarious hope. The world, for so long frozen and silent, began to weep. Water dripped from the eaves of the cabin and the heavy branches of the pines, a sound like 1,000 tiny, ticking clocks counting down to an unknown event. The air, once sharp and sterile, now carried the rich, loamy scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, the smell of life returning. But with the melting snow came the softening of the trails and the opening of the pass. The mountain was no longer a fortress. It was an open door. The fragile peace that had settled between Eleanor and Jack after his confession by the barn was as tentative as the spring thaw. The walls between them had not been rebuilt, but the rubble remained, a constant reminder of the fragility of their sanctuary. They spoke more, their conversations circling around the practicalities of survival, but a deep, unspoken current of fear and anticipation ran beneath every word. Jack's eyes were constantly scanning the tree line, his hand never far from the rifle that leaned by the door. The rider arrived on a Tuesday, a day of deceptive sunshine and brilliant blue skies. He was not a man of the mountains. He rode a fine, black thoroughbred that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop, and he wore a fine, dark wool coat that was already spattered with the mud of the lower trails. He pulled his horse to a halt a respectful distance from the cabin, but there was nothing respectful in his posture. He sat tall in the saddle, a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed. Eleanor was by the woodpile when she saw him. Her blood ran cold. The face was older, harsher than she remembered, but the eyes were the same. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a man who saw the world as a collection of objects to be acquired, used, and discarded. It was Martin Bellows. Jack emerged from the cabin, drawn by the sound of the horse. He moved to stand slightly in front of Eleanor, his body a solid, immovable shield. His face was a mask of granite, but Eleanor, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, saw the storm gathering in his eyes. "That is far enough," Jack called out, his voice a low, lethal growl that carried easily in the still mountain air. Martin Bellows smiled, a thin, unpleasant stretching of his lips that did not reach his eyes. "I am here for my property," he said, his voice the smooth, cultured baritone that had once charmed her father and now turned her stomach. His gaze flickered past Jack to settle on Eleanor, a look of smug, possessive appraisal. "Eleanor, my dear, you have caused a great deal of trouble. Your father is worried sick. It is time to come home." "She ain't going anywhere with you," Jack said, his voice flat and final. Martin's smile tightened. "I'm afraid she has no choice in the matter. We have a contract, an arrangement of marriage, signed and witnessed. She is my betrothed. By law, she belongs with me." He reached into his coat and produced a sheaf of papers. "I have documents, and I have the law on my side." "Your documents are worthless up here," Jack said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "And the only law on this mountain is the one I make. You have one chance to get on your horse and ride back down the way you came. You will not get a second." The barely contained violence in Jack's voice was a living thing. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Martin's face. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized the absolute, uncompromising power in the man standing before him. He was a bully who relied on the weapons of paper and influence. He was not prepared for a weapon of pure, primal force. "This is not over," Martin spat, his face flushing with anger. He pulled sharply on his horse's reins, turning the animal so violently it skittered on the damp ground. "You will regret this." He kicked the horse into a gallop and disappeared back down the trail, a wake of displaced mud and impotent fury in his path. They stood in silence for a long moment after he was gone, the sudden quiet of the clearing a stark contrast to the pounding of Eleanor's heart. "He will be back," Jack said, his voice grim. "And he will not be alone." He was right. They came 2 days later, a small, grim posse of 4 men riding up the trail. Eleanor saw them from the window. Martin was at their head, his face a mask of triumphant spite. Beside him rode the sheriff from Grady's Hill, a portly, nervous man whose authority seemed to be a costume he wore with great discomfort. Behind them were 2 deputies, their faces hard and impassive. Jack met them at the door, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. Eleanor stood just behind him, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. "Jack Coulter," the sheriff said, his voice attempting a bluster it could not quite achieve. "I have a warrant here, issued by a judge down in Helena. It is for the retrieval of one Eleanor Vance, a fugitive from an arranged marriage contract." He held up a piece of paper, the official seal a small, red blotch against the white. "We are here to escort the lady back to the custody of her fiancé, Mr. Bellows." "You are not taking her," Jack said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now, see here, Coulter." The sheriff puffed. "This is the law. You can't stand in the way of the law. Step aside." "She is not property," Jack said, his eyes locking on Martin's smug face. "And you are not setting one foot in this cabin. If you resist, we will be forced to arrest you for obstruction," the sheriff warned, his hand drifting nervously toward the pistol at his hip. Martin spurred his horse forward a step. "Enough of this foolishness. Eleanor, come out here now. Do not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." It was the tone of his voice, the casual, commanding assumption of ownership, that broke the last thread of Jack's restraint. He moved. It was not a decision. It was an instinct, a single, brutal, lightning-fast motion. He lunged forward, grabbed the nearest deputy by the front of his coat, and pulled him clean off his horse. Before the man could even cry out, Jack's fist connected with his jaw. The sound was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The deputy's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Chaos erupted. The sheriff shouted, fumbling for his gun. Martin swore, trying to control his frightened horse. Jack did not hesitate. He spun around, grabbed Eleanor's arm, and pulled her back inside the cabin. "Get your coat," he commanded, his face a terrible mask of grim purpose. "We are leaving now." He barred the door, then grabbed his saddlebags, stuffing them with ammunition, jerky, and a small sack of coffee. Eleanor moved as if in a dream, her body numb, her mind reeling. She had ruined him. In a single violent act of protection, he had made himself an outlaw. She had brought the wreckage of her past to his door, and now his life was burning with it. He pushed her toward the back of the cabin, where a small, shuttered window looked out into the dense pine forest. He kicked it open. "Go," he said. "I will get the horse and meet you by the old trapper's line." They fled into the woods, the shouts of the posse echoing behind them. The world became a desperate, lung-searing scramble through a tangled labyrinth of snow-laden pines and treacherous, half-frozen streams. Jack led the way, pulling his horse behind him, his knowledge of the mountain their only advantage. They moved with a desperate, animal urgency, driven by the knowledge that to be caught meant the end of everything. Hours later, as the sun began to sink behind the jagged peaks, they found their refuge, a small, dilapidated trapper's shack, half hidden in a narrow ravine. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs with a sagging roof, smelling of old smoke and animal musk. But it was shelter. Jack tethered the horse in a thicket of spruce where it would be hidden from view, then collapsed onto the dirt floor of the shack, his chest heaving. Eleanor sank down opposite him, and the full, crushing weight of what had happened finally broke through her shock. A terrible, ragged sob tore from her throat. "This is my fault," she wept, the words choked and broken. "All of it. I should have never come here. I am a plague, a harbinger of ruin. I have destroyed you. Jack, they will hunt you now. For what you did. For me." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it felt like it was tearing her apart. She had traded her gilded cage for a life of freedom, but she had only succeeded in dragging the man she loved into a cage of his own. Jack pushed himself across the small space and knelt before her. He pulled her hands away from her face, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were wild, fierce, and filled with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "Listen to me," he said, his voice a raw, urgent whisper. "You have destroyed nothing. You have given me something to fight for. Do you understand? I would burn down the world for you." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking away her tears. "You do not belong to anyone. Not to him, not to your father, not even to me, but I will bleed to make sure you are free." His words were a vow, a prayer, a declaration of war. They settled deep in her soul, a hot, fierce coal of hope in the cold ashes of her despair. They heard the posse before they saw them, the sounds of men and horses crashing through the undergrowth. Jack was on his feet in an instant, pushing Eleanor toward the back of the shack and raising his rifle. "Stay down," he commanded. The standoff was short and brutal. The posse emerged into the ravine, their guns drawn. "Coulter," the sheriff yelled. "It is over. Come on out." A gunshot answered him, not from Jack's rifle, but from one of the deputies, a nervous, premature shot that ricocheted off the logs of the shack. And then the world exploded in a hail of gunfire. Jack returned fire, not to kill, but to keep them back. His shots aimed at the trees above their heads. Eleanor huddled on the floor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw a flash of movement as one of the deputies tried to circle around the side of the shack. Jack saw him too. He moved to block the angle, stepping for a fraction of a second into the open doorway to get a clear shot. It was all the time they needed. A single shot rang out, sharper than the others. Jack cried out, a sharp, grunting sound of pain, and staggered back, his hand flying to his shoulder. A dark, crimson stain was already spreading across the fabric of his shirt. Something inside Eleanor broke. The fear did not vanish. It crystallized. It turned from a passive, paralyzing terror into a cold, hard, razor-sharp rage. The woman who had cowered and wept and blamed herself was gone. In her place was the woman who had survived a brutal journey, who had learned to live in the wilderness, who had been taught to shoot by the man who now lay bleeding on the floor for her. She scrambled across the floor and grabbed the rifle from his weakening grasp. "No, Eleanor," he gasped, but his voice was faint. She did not listen. She rose to her feet and stepped into the doorway, the rifle braced against her shoulder as he had taught her. She sighted down the barrel, her hands surprisingly steady. She saw the shocked faces of the men below, their guns momentarily lowered at the sight of her. She did not aim at any of them. She aimed at a thick pine branch just above the sheriff's head. She took a breath. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report echoing through the ravine. The branch above the sheriff exploded in a shower of splinters and snow. The men ducked, crying out in alarm. Eleanor lowered the rifle just enough to meet their eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of the terrified woman who had fled from St. Louis. It was calm, it was steady, and it was deadly. "The next one will not be a warning," she said. "Leave, now!" She was not pleading. She was giving an order. There was an authority in her voice, a promise of violence in her eyes that they had not expected. They saw not a helpless mail-order bride, but a cornered animal, a she-wolf defending her wounded mate. The sheriff looked from her cold, determined face to the unconscious deputy they had left behind, to the blood on Jack's shirt. This was not worth dying for. He gave a sharp, curt nod to his men. They holstered their weapons, mounted their horses, and retreated back the way they came, leaving a profound and ringing silence in their wake. As soon as they were gone, the adrenaline that had held her up drained away, and she stumbled back into the shack. Jack had slumped against the wall, his face pale and beaded with sweat, his eyes struggling to stay open. "You did it," he whispered, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. "Be quiet and save your strength," she ordered, her voice trembling now that the danger was past. She tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound in his shoulder. He gasped in pain. The bullet had gone clean through, a blessing of sorts. But he was losing a great deal of blood. She found his small mending kit in his saddlebags, the same one she had used to repair his shirts. It held a needle and some gut thread. She sterilized the needle in the flame of a match, her hands shaking but her purpose firm. She had to stitch the wound closed, or he would bleed to death. She knelt beside him, her face close to his. "This is going to hurt," she said softly. He just nodded, his eyes closing. As she began the first clumsy, agonizing stitch, she saw the tears that squeezed from beneath his closed eyelids. "You do not have to pretend you are strong," she whispered, her own tears falling onto his face, mingling with his. "Not with me." He drifted in and out of consciousness as she worked, his breathing shallow, his body racked with shivers. She stitched the wound as best she could, her movements becoming surer with each pass of the needle, then bound it tightly with more strips from her petticoat. She covered him with every blanket they had, trying to fight back the encroaching chill of shock. She held his head in her lap, stroking his hair, whispering to him, begging him to hold on. In a moment of lucidity, his eyes fluttered open. He looked up at her, his gaze hazy with pain but clear with a profound, unwavering emotion. He lifted a trembling hand and touched her cheek. His lips moved, forming 3 words, a final, desperate confession from the depths of his fading strength. "I love you." And then his eyes closed, and he went limp in her arms. The fever was a cruel thief, stealing time and strength in the dead of night. For weeks, Jack's world was a hazy, red-tinged landscape of pain, thirst, and fragmented nightmares. He drifted in and out of a shallow, tormented sleep, his mind a battlefield where the ghosts of Sand Creek fought alongside the fresh, raw memory of the posse in the ravine. Through it all, there was a constant, steady presence, a cool cloth on his forehead, a spoonful of broth pressed gently to his lips, a soft voice that cut through the delirium, pulling him back from the brink, anchoring him to the living world. Eleanor became the sole keeper of his life. The roles they had played were completely reversed. He, the strong, silent protector, was now as helpless as a newborn, his powerful body reduced to a weak, fever-racked vessel. She, the fragile Eastern woman, became a pillar of unwavering strength. She cleaned and dressed his wound every day, her hands never shaking, her stomach no longer turning at the sight of blood and torn flesh. She hunted using the skills he had taught her, bringing back small game to make the nourishing broths that kept him alive. She hauled water, chopped wood, and stood watch in the long, dark nights, the rifle never far from her side. He would wake sometimes, in the quiet, lucid hours between the waves of fever, and just watch her. He saw the new, hard-won competence in her movements, the determined set of her jaw. He saw the deep purple smudges of exhaustion under her eyes, and a wave of guilt and a fierce, protective love would wash over him. He had brought this on her, but she was not breaking. She was being forged. The fire that had threatened to consume them both was instead tempering her into something new, something strong and beautiful and terrifyingly resilient. He remembered his desperate, pain-fueled confession. "I love you," and the words hung in the silence between them. An unacknowledged truth. He did not have the strength to say them again, and she did not ask him to. Her tireless, gentle care was her answer. As the last of the snow melted from all but the highest peaks, and the first pale green buds appeared on the aspen trees, a rider came up the mountain. It was Silas, the old man who sometimes carried mail and supplies to the outlying homesteads. He approached the cabin with a nervous caution, having heard the wild stories in town about the shootout. Eleanor met him on the porch, her expression calm and neutral. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Got some news from the land office. Thought you ought to know." He handed her a thick, oilskin pouch. "It is about the vicar's claim." Eleanor took the pouch inside, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the string. Jack, propped up on pillows in his bed, watched her, his eyes clear of fever for the first time in a week. She pulled out a stack of documents, her eyes scanning the dense, legal script. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice a dry rasp. Eleanor looked up from the papers, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. "The land dispute. It has been resolved. The man who killed Harold, Jebediah Stone. His claim was found to be fraudulent. He had moved the markers, just as Harold had said." She looked down at the final document, a heavy sheet of parchment with an official seal at the bottom. The circuit judge reviewed the original contract Harold made. It was a homesteading agreement. The land and the title were to be his upon his marriage. Since he died before the contract could be completed, and since I, the other party to the agreement, was here and had fulfilled my part of the journey, the judge has ruled in my favor. She sank into a chair, the deed held loosely in her hands. "The claim. It is mine. The land, the cabin Harold was building. It is all in my name. I am a landowner." The words felt foreign. Impossible. She was no longer a mail-order bride, a fugitive, a ward, or a burden. She was a woman of property. She had a place in the world that was legally, unequivocally, hers. It was a kind of power she had never imagined, a security that had been bought with Harold Vickers' blood and her own tears. When Jack was finally strong enough to walk, a new problem arose. The town of Grady's Hill, for all its judgment and suspicion, was a practical place. Spring was calving season, and a long, hard winter had left the ranchers with weakened herds and a need for skilled hands. And no one in the territory knew horses and cattle like Jack Coulter. A delegation of 2 ranchers made the tense, awkward journey up to his cabin, hats in their hands, their eyes shifting nervously from Jack's still-bandaged shoulder to the rifle that always leaned near the door. They offered him a handsome wage to help with the spring roundup. Jack was inclined to refuse, to stay in the sanctuary of his mountain. But Eleanor knew that they could not hide forever. "We have to go back down. Jack," she said after the ranchers had left. "We have to face them. I have to file this deed at the courthouse." And so they rode down the mountain together. It was a different journey from the one she had made in the depths of winter. The trail was flanked by a riot of green and the bright, hopeful colors of wildflowers. The air was warm and sweet. She rode a gentle mare from Jack's small stable, sitting tall and straight, her head held high. Jack rode beside her, his face grim, his eyes scanning the town as it came into view, ready for a fight. Their arrival in Grady's Hill caused an immediate stir. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare. The whispers started up at once, a rustle of speculation and judgment that followed them down the muddy main street. But something was different. The stares were still curious, but they were tinged with a new, grudging respect. They saw the man who had taken on the law and walked away, and they saw the woman who had stood by his side, who now owned one of the most promising claims in the valley. Eleanor did not flinch. She met their stares with a calm, level gaze, daring them to judge her. She had survived a winter that would have broken most people. She had nursed a man back from the brink of death and faced down a posse with a rifle in her hands. The whispers of small-minded people were no longer a weapon that could harm her. Their first stop was the courthouse, where Eleanor filed her deed. The clerk, a man who had barely given her the time of day on her first arrival, was now all deference and respect, addressing her as Ma'am and Miss Vance. As she signed her name to the official register, she felt the finality of it, the closing of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. The true reckoning came when the circuit judge arrived to hear the case against Martin Bellows. The saloon was converted into a makeshift courtroom, and it was packed with every citizen of Grady's Hill, all of them eager for the spectacle. Martin stood before the judge, his face a mask of arrogant confidence, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of the miners and ranchers. He presented his marriage contract, his voice smooth and persuasive. But the judge, a grizzled old man with eyes that missed nothing, was not impressed. He had the testimony of the sheriff, who, under the judge's sharp questioning, admitted that Martin had offered him a substantial sum of money to ensure Eleanor's retrieval. The judge examined the marriage contract and then produced a letter from Eleanor's own father, a panicked, rambling missive disavowing any knowledge of Martin's violent methods. It turned out that when Martin's pursuit had resulted in a shootout with a local citizen, Eleanor's father had quickly and completely abandoned him to save his own reputation. The judge slammed his gavel down, the sound cracking through the silent room. He declared Martin's documents invalid, likely forgeries, and the marriage contract void due to evidence of coercion and abuse. Then, in a move that stunned the entire courtroom, he ordered Martin Bellows arrested on charges of bribery of a law officer and extortion. Martin's carefully constructed facade shattered. He sputtered and raged, his face turning a blotchy, apoplectic red as the deputies, the same men who had once ridden with him, clamped irons on his wrists and hauled him away. The external threat, the ghost that had hunted her across a continent, was finally and irrevocably gone. A great, shuddering breath escaped Eleanor's lips, a breath she felt she had been holding for years. They rode back up to the cabin in the warm twilight. The air was still and peaceful. Inside, the fire was burning low, casting a soft, gentle glow on the familiar room. It was no longer a refuge, a place to hide. It was a home. Jack said nothing, but he moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He took his sharpest hunting knife, the one he used for fine, detailed work, and knelt on the hearth. He found a large, smooth stone that was set into the very center of the fireplace, a keystone that anchored the entire structure. He began to carve into its surface. Eleanor watched him, her heart full. The soft scrape of the knife on the stone was the only sound. He was not a man of easy words or grand gestures. He was a man of the earth, of wood and stone and iron. He carved 2 sets of initials, the letters deep and plain and strong, intertwined with one another. J, C, and E, V. He finished and ran his thumb over the letters, wiping away the stone dust. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw the wilderness and the warmth, the scars and the strength, the terrible loss and the fierce, quiet love that defined him. He did not ask a question. He made a statement, a promise, a vow. "This home's ours now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound and overwhelming joy. She knelt before him on the hearth and placed her hand over his, over the initials that bound them together. She could not speak past the lump in her throat, so she simply nodded again and again. Yes, their love was not a soft or easy thing. It had not been born in a genteel parlor with poetry and flowers. It had been forged in a crucible of snow and silence, of fear and blood and survival. It was a weathered and bruised and scarred thing, like the ancient pines that clung to the mountainside. But it was real. It was strong enough to withstand any storm. One last late-season storm did come, a gentle, unseasonable snowfall that blanketed the new spring green in a layer of quiet white. Jack woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was the sound of soft, quiet weeping. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He turned and saw Eleanor standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the pale, moonlit snow, her shoulders shaking. He went to her, his heart pounding. "Eleanor, what is it? Are you sad?" She turned to him, and even in the dim light, he could see that her face was awash with tears. But she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful, broken smile. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with a profound, cathartic release. "I am not sad. I am crying because, for the first time in my entire life, I feel completely and utterly safe." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He buried his face in her hair and felt the last of his own ghosts finally, mercifully, recede. The long war was over. He was home. He kissed her temple, a soft, reverent touch. "No more pretending," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. "Not ever again." Outside, the snow fell quietly, blanketing the world in a pristine, peaceful silence. But inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth burned warm and strong, and its light filled every corner of the room. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.